How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Chav, Daf 120 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, well, today the first part of the day, we're going to continue with the Mishnah that we began at the end of the day yesterday, talking about like when you have two brothers and they are married, and then very Yevamos-y kind of thing, right? They died and they have to do Yibum, but they're dead, but they're not, but they're maybe that. And then we talk about at what point can you tell if somebody's dead? That's actually kind of an important question, right? At what point is, like, if you have to identify a dead body, right? How can you know who it is? How are you able to identify them? So, okay, so we're going to begin on Daf Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis, 6 lines from the bottom. Nisyabmu vamesu, by the two dots, hayuvamin asurin li'nasir balazu omer hol v'huchu li'yuvamin huchu l'chol adam. Friends, what in the world is this talking about? Well, here we go. Yevamos, friends, third to last day doing these things. Reuven, Shimon, brothers. Reuven married to Sarah. Shimon married to Rivka. Sarah says, Reuven, the love of my life, is gestorben. Rivka says, Shimon, the love of my life, gestorben. And so now, okay, so there's Levi and Yehuda. So Sarah says that Reuven's dead. So what does she do? She does Yibum with Levi, right? There's no kids, of course. Rivka says Shimon's dead. She does Yibum with Yehuda. Now, if we take a step back for a second, what if there was no Levi and Yehuda? What if it was only Reuven and Shimon? There are no other brothers. So then we said that Sarah and Rivka are shtickle stuck because sister-in-laws aren't able to testify about each other. So therefore, while we believe Sarah that Reuven is dead, we only believe Rivka that Shimon is dead to the extent that she now has to do, that Rivka now has to do, Yibum, as a chiyuv Yibum, whatever. But we can't trust Rivka that Shimon is dead to the extent that Sarah can now go marry somebody else because, Reuven's dead and Shimon's dead. No, we believe her that Reuven's dead, but we only believe Rivka that Shimon's dead with regard to Rivka, but not as testimony for Sarah. So now, but what happens if there is Levi and Yehuda? So Sarah says that Reuven is dead, and then she does Yibum with Levi. Rivka says that Shimon is dead. She does Yibum with Yehuda. Now what happens? Levi and Yehuda die. So on the one hand, we could say, well, it just reverts to the original situation. You got Sarah and Rivka. They were married to Reuven and Shimon. And they're shtickle stuck because, Reuven's dead, but she can't do even with Shimon because we can't believe Rivka that Shimon's actually dead with regard to Sarah being able to do Yibum with him. Therefore, we have to assume that Shimon's still alive with regard, in relation to Sarah, and we don't know where he is, so she's kind of stuck. But here's the catch. They already, based on their testimony, we allowed them to marry Levi and Yehuda. Like, we trusted them to the extent that Sarah married her brother-in-law and Rivka married her brother-in-law based on their testimony. So now that we've gone that far as to allow them to marry their brother-in-laws, and then the brother-in-laws die, can we say, you know what, we trusted them this far to marry an erva, we can actually trust them that their respective spouses are dead, and now, Sarah and Rivka can each go and marry whoever they want and live their best life, because, we can assume from the fact that we allowed them to marry their brother-in-laws based on their testimony, we can assume that Reuven and Shimon are in fact dead. So, that's the shaila. So, therefore, said the Mishnah, Nisyabmu vamesu hayuvamin. So if Sarah and Rivka married Levi and Yehuda, but then Levi and Yehuda die, asurin linasi. So the Tanna Kama says, well, it just reverts back to the original status, which is they're once again forbidden to get remarried because we can only believe them with regard to themselves, but not with regard to the implications that it has for their sister-in-law. Rabbi Elazar Omer, whereas Rabbi Elazar says, since we allowed them to marry their brother-in-laws, Levi and Yehuda, well then when Levi and Yehuda die, we could say, you know what, we trusted them to marry their brother-in-laws, we can assume that Reuven and Shimon are dead, Sarah and Rivka can now go and live their best lives. So by Rav, my time to Rabbi Elazar. So finally we could start the Gemara. Rav asks a kasha, he says, how come Rabbi Elazar says that, what's his rationale for saying that since Sarah and Rivka married Levi and Yehuda, when Levi and Yehuda die, now they can go and live their best lives? Is it mishum tikasavet Sarah mi'ida lachaverta? Is it because simply Rabbi Elazar holds that one, in this case Yevama, can testify for another Yevama, right? That Sarah is allowed to testify with it, right? And the implications for Rivka, right? Meaning Sarah is able to testify that her husband Reuven is dead, and the implication being that Rivka is now going to be able to go live her best life and marry somebody else. And does Rabbi Elazar say that that's fine? Sarah can testify for Rivka, and vice versa, Rivka can testify for Sarah? Or is the reason that we trust Sarah and Rivka because, well, now that they went and acted on their own testimony, right? Sarah said that Reuven is Geshturban, and she went based on that testimony and married Levi. So is the point that what Rabbi Elazar is saying is since they demonstrated by marrying Levi and Yehuda respectively that their testimony is true and that they were willing to marry an erva based on their testimony, so they've proven that their testimony is true, and that's why we can trust them. So again, by Rav, my time with Rabbi Elazar, how come Rabbi Elazar says that once Sarah and Rivka marry Levi and Yehuda, they can go and live their best lives? Is it mishum the ksaver Sarah mi'ida l'chaverta? Is it because they say, look, a co-wife, or in this case Yevamos, right, sister-in-laws can testify about each other? Or is it that no, she's not going to get herself into a pickle, and therefore, by marrying their brother-in-laws, Levi and Yehuda respectively, they demonstrated that they're telling the truth, and that is why Sarah and Rivka can go live their best lives according to Rabbi Elazar if Levi and Yehuda die. Wow, I'm excited to move on to Ksubis. Fine. So the my nafkamina. So what's the nafkamina? What's the difference if we say that it's because we trust the tzaras or if it's because they demonstrated it? Well, it's to marry the co-wife before her. What does that mean? Well, it's talking about a situation where what happens? Sarah and Reuven go and, I think that's the case. Sarah and Reuven go and travel someplace, and Sarah comes back and says that Reuven is Geshtorben. Now there's a co-wife who didn't go on the trip, Rivka. So the question is, based on Sarah's testimony, can Rivka now assume that Reuven is Geshtorben and go live her best life with some other guy? So then Suve Sarah Mikamedida. Can Rivka get married before Sarah does? Remarried before Sarah gets remarried? If you say that according to Rabbi Elazar, well, it's no problem for one co-wife to testify about the other co-wife. Well, then even if Sarah does not get remarried, Rivka can, because Rivka can testify for what? Even though Sarah does not get remarried, Rivka can, because Sarah is able to testify on behalf of her co-wife, Rivka. But if you say that the rationale for Rabbi Elazar is that in our Mishnah, the reason why Sarah and Rivka were able to go and live their best lives is because they demonstrated by marrying Levi and Yehuda that they were telling the truth. Well, in that case, Insiv Menazvinon Lo, well then if Sarah gets remarried demonstrating that Reuven is really Geshturban, so only then, right, Insiv, if Sarah gets remarried, Menazvinon Lo Sarah, then Rivka can get remarried. Ilo Insiv, if Sarah does not get remarried, Lo Menazvinon Lo, well then we would not allow Rivka to get remarried because we need Sarah to demonstrate that she's telling the truth by getting remarried first. Tashma, so what do we say? Tashma, come here. Rabbi Lazar Omer, says Rabbi Lazar, Hol v'hutru liYevamin, hutru l'chol adam. Now the Mishnah had said, since they demonstrated that, right, since Sarah and Rivka demonstrated by marrying Levi and Yehuda, that they were telling the truth, that's why they can go now, when Levi and Yehuda die, they can go and live their best lives. So I understand if the rationale is that Sarah, meaning the way we understand is that Sarah and Rivka are not going to get themselves into a pickle. And by demonstrating, by marrying Levi and Yehuda, that they're telling the truth, so we can assume that they're telling the truth. And that is, if they, right, so in that case, Dafka, because they demonstrated by marrying Levi and Yehuda, that's why they can live their best lives when Levi and Yehuda die. So here also, Davka, if Sarah gets remarried, only then can Rivka get remarried. But if you say that the rationale in the Mishnah for Sarah and Rivka to get remarried after marrying Levi and Yehuda is because co-wives are able to remarry, are able to trust each other. Well then, in our Mishnah, even if they would not have gotten remarried to Levi and Yehuda, we still would be able to believe them, because if we're saying that, co-wives can testify for each other, or in this case, Yevamos can testify about each other, so then why would they need to marry Levi and Yehuda in between? So we see from our Mishnah that the reason for Rabbi Lazar is Davka, because they got remarried to Levi and Yehuda, that now when Levi and Yehuda died, they can go and live their best lives. And therefore, in this case as well, when Sarah comes back from her trip with Reuven and testifies that Reuven's gestorben, so then Sarah would first need to get remarried and demonstrate that she's telling the truth, and only then would Rivka be able to get remarried. Rabbi Lazar, so now says the Gemara, meh. Says the Gemara, not necessarily. Because we could say Rabbi Lazar l'divreim ka'amelu, that Rabbi Lazar might really just be responding to the rabbis. L'didi tsara me'ida lachaverta. He might be saying, look, according to me, I Rabbi Lazar hold, that a co-wife can testify for the other. When Sarah comes back and says that Reuven's gestorben, Rivka can get remarried immediately. And even if Sarah doesn't get remarried first, Rivka can go ahead. But you people, the Chachamim, at least admit to me that at least if Rivka first gets remarried, if Sarah first gets remarried, at least at that point she demonstrated that she's willing to get remarried, Eishes Ish, or in our Mishnah, right, she was willing to marry her brother-in-law, which is Erva. So that you have to, the Rebbe Lazar would say to the rabbis, at least in that case where she demonstrated, at least admit to me that we could trust her vis-a-vis the co-wife. Mishum dehi lo mekalkal nafsha, because surely Sarah, or in our Mishnah, Sarah and Rivka are not going to put themselves in a bind. Whereas the rabbis say, meh. The rabbis say that not necessarily. Let's take this example over here. Sarah's on a trip with Reuven, comes back and says Reuven's gestorben. The rabbis will say, just because Sarah gets remarried, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's telling the truth. Maybe she's saying Tamos Nafshi and Plishtim. Maybe she's saying like Shimshon said when he killed the Philistines and killed himself while he was at the same time. Maybe he's saying, I'm going to go down with them. And maybe Sarah's saying, look, I know I'm not telling the truth, and I'm going to get remarried anyways, just so that my co-wife Rivka will get remarried and do the wrong thing. I'm willing to get in big trouble and get remarried, even though I know that Reuven is alive, just so that Rivka will get remarried, and I'll go down with her. Come in here. Sarah goes and travels with her husband Reuven to some place. And then she comes back and she says, my husband's Reuven's gestorben. Tinase visito ksubaso, she can get remarried and she could chaperein the ksubim. Vitzaraso asura. But Rivke, asura, she cannot get remarried. Rabbi Elazar Omer says, Rabbi Elazar, Ho'avuhutra hi hutrana mitzara also. And Rabbi Elazar says that since Sarah is permitted to get remarried, so then Rivka is also permitted to get remarried. So what do we see? So it doesn't say that Sarah actually got remarried. It says that she's permitted to get remarried. So clearly it seems that since Sarah says that Reuven's Gishtorbim, we could trust her for Rivka as well. Same, right? So therefore we see that one Kohev can testify for the other Kohev. Ema hol vehutra v'nises, rather say, no, since Davka, Sarah got, Davka got remarried, right? Ema hol vehutra v'nises. Right, Rabbi Elazar would Davka say, since Sarah is permitted to get remarried and did get remarried, that is why Rivka can get remarried. But v'leichush dama begita asoy, by the ka'amra hochi likalkula l'tzara hidi mechavna. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, but even so, even if you say that Sarah did get remarried, but maybe what happened was that really Sarah and Reuven got divorced. Maybe Reuven didn't die. Maybe Sarah and Reuven got divorced, and that's why Sarah is confident to go and get married to somebody else, because she's divorced from Reuven. But she's going to say, just so that Rivka will get messed up, she's going to say that Reuven died, just so that Rivka will go and get remarried when she's still an Eshes Ish. So shouldn't we be concerned about that? So therefore, Rabbi Elazar, just because Sarah goes and gets remarried doesn't necessarily mean that Reuven's dead. It might just mean that they got divorced. And maybe she's just getting, she's saying that Reuven's dead, just that Rivka will go and get remarried improperly. So, look, if she went and got remarried to a Yisrael, then yeah, we would have to be concerned that maybe she actually got divorced. But here we're talking about where Sarah went and Taka married a Kohen, and therefore she wouldn't, if she got divorced from Reuven, she wouldn't be able to marry a Kohen. So from the fact that she married a Kohen, it demonstrates that when she says that Reuven died, he really did die, and now she's marrying a Kohen as an almana, and therefore Rivka would be able to get remarried based on that testimony and demonstration that Reuven is really Gishtorben. So now we get to a new Mishnah. Pretty interesting Mishnah. It talks about I don't know, let's do the Mishnah. In Midin Ela al parts of Panim Machotem. So in order to identify a corpse and to identify it as being the person who you understand it to be, in Midin Ela al parts of Panim Machotem, they have to have a face with a nose. Even if there might be other signs on their body or on their clothes. I remember this reminds me of a story of a fellow a few years ago. I think a young fellow passed away in India, and I think there was a Chabad rabbi there who was able to identify this fellow by a tattoo that he had, which is interesting. That's an interesting shaila, right? Because I don't know, it's not a face and a nose or something, but right. So machota. So we're going to see in the Gemara a little bit things that are similar. Super interesting. Fine. So sheish simanim begufa v'chelev. Right. So even if there are other signs on his body or in his clothing, we cannot necessarily rely on those. In meidin ela achetetze nafsho, we can't testify until he actually dies. Even if you saw him with lots of wounds, vitzaluv, or wait, does that mean what's tzoluv? When they nail you into a cross, kaza? Oh, hanging from a gallows, dude. That seems shver. V'achaya ocheles bo, or if wild animals eating him. Oh man, shver. You can only testify for him for the first 3 days. After 3 days, we cannot assume that the corpse is in a condition that you can still identify it. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava Omer, whereas Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, wait a second. Lo kol ha'adam V'lo kol hamakom, v'lo kol hashos shavim. It's not objective like this. 3 days. It's not always going to be less than 3 days. It's not always going to be more than 3 days. Although the Gemara is going to ask, is Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava being lenient or stringent? But he says, not every fellow is the same, not every place is the same, and not every hour of the day is the same, right? Some people maybe may change quicker, or certain times of the day, if it's cold, if it's hot. There are other factors. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, padachas v'lo partzuf. If a fellow has a forehead but he doesn't have a face, panim v'lo parts of panim, not a face. Parts of panim v'lo padachas. If he has a face, but not a forehead. In me'idin, you can't testify. Achiyu shneim. You have to have a face and a forehead. Imachotem, with a nose. Amar Abai says, Abai b'temer of kahana mikra. Where do we see a pasuk to support this? Hakoras pneim onsabon. That the recognition of their face answered for them. All right. Abba bar Marta, do Abba bar Manyomi, have a maske bei dverish gelusa zuze. So Abba bar Marta, who I guess was Abba bar Manyomi, owed money to the Reish Gelusa, and he had to pass by the Reish Gelusa, but he also didn't want them to stop him and give him a hard time. So you know what he did? I say Kira, Dovak bivlaisa, so he took wax and put the wax on a cloth, Dovak ba'apuse, and then rubbed it on his forehead, and kind of changed the appearance of his forehead. Cholav kamayu, and then he passed by the Reish Gelusa v'lo b'shakrua, and they didn't even recognize him because his forehead was changed. Looking in the video right now, my forehead is right now covered with hair. What's the nafkaminas? Can I just walk by somewhere and they won't recognize me? Interesting shaila. Let's go weiter. Baruch Hashem, my head is covered in hair. Somebody told me that I should appreciate it. You never know when it's going to fall out. All right. That's right. I don't know when it's going to fall out. I don't really think about it too much. Lamaisa, let's go weiter. So we said even though there are signs. So but 1 second, does that imply that these signs are not midoraisa? Right? We're saying that even though there are other signs on his body, we cannot use those as an identification. We have a kasha. You have a fellow who was a messenger to deliver a bill of divorce, and he lost it. And then he finds it. Where does he find it? Tied to his wallet or his a pouch, a money pouch, a wallet, a ring, things that belong to him. Oshininsa ben Kalev, or among his, stuff. So he recognizes that these things that this get is found with are his. Even if it's a long time later, kosher. So here we see that based on these signs that he's identifying these items that the get is bundled with as his, we're going to allow us to give this bill of divorce to a woman and permit her to get remarried. So that's Eishasish, that's Doraisa, based on recognition of these items that the get is with. Amar Abaye lo kashe, Rabbi Eliezer ben Ma'avoy ha'Rabbanon. So says Rabbi, no problem. So machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer ben Ma'avoy and the Rabbanon regarding, can you rely upon signs or not? The Tanya is learning about. Say ein me'idin ala shuma. You cannot testify that somebody is dead based on a wart, I think, a wart or a mole. Beautiful. So you can't testify based on a mole. If a fellow had a certain mole, so you can't say, oh, that's him, I recognize the mole. Rabbi Eliezer ben Ma'avoy Omer, says Rabbi Eliezer ben Ma'avoy me'idin, that we can testify based on a mole. So let's say that when we say by the get that we can rely upon signs, it's like Rabbi Eliezer ben Ma'avoy. When we say in our Mishnah we cannot rely upon these signs, it's like the Tanakama. Let's say that this is machlokas, the Marsava Simon Doraisa, Marsava Simon Dorabonon. So let's say that Rabbi Eliezer ben Ma'avoy says that Simon Doraisa, whereas the Tanakama says they're only Dorabonon. Amar Rav Luchuliyama Simon Doraisa. Says Rav, no. Everybody holds that Simonim can work even Mida Oraisa. So, and how do we understand the machlokas Like, why does the Tanakama say that we can't rely upon the mole? The Tanakama is, well, do we assume that these moles are common among people of that age, which would make it, if lots of people have these moles in these places, well then, it's not really a very good identifier because lots of people have them. Tanakama says, look, lots of people at that age, whatever age this person was, may have moles, so it's not a very stark identifier. It's not an objective identifier. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Mavoy says, nah, it's not so common, and therefore if you recognize the mole, you recognize the fellow. And those who say those who say that the machlokas between the Tanakhama and Rabbi Eliezer ben Mavoy is, do moles change after death? My sover asuya l'ishtanos la'achar miso, my sover ein asuya l'ishtanos la'achar miso. Tanakama says that, look, moles change after death, and therefore you can't rely upon them. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Mavoy says moles don't change after death, therefore you can rely upon them. Or Rabbi Eliezer says, no, everyone agrees that simonim, that these signs are only midrabon. The machlokas here between Rabbi Eliezer ben Mavoy and Tanakama is a mole something that even, that is undisputable? Meaning, even though in general we say that signs are only midrabanan, but a mole is pashit, the best kind of indisputable sign that there is. Fellow has a mole, Rabbi Eliezer ben Mavoy says, that's the fellow. Found the mole, found the fellow. Whereas Tanakama says, not necessarily. My sover siman muvok, my sover lav siman muvok. Rabbi Eliezer ben Mavoy says it's siman muvok. Tanakama says it's not. So now Rava had said, right, one of the first version of Rava was that everyone agrees that signs are mido oraisa. So al katani afal pi sheyesh simonim begufo uvechelav. But 1 second, didn't we say in our Mishnah that even though the fellow has certain signs on his body or on his clothing, so we cannot use those as identifiers? But Rava, didn't you say that everyone agrees it's the oraisa, that signs work even with the oraisa? So gufo the aruch v'gots. Well, when it says in the Mishnah that signs of his body, these aren't like significant signs. We're talking about, was he tall or was he short? There's lots of tall people, lots of short people. Kelev the chashin and the sheila. And clothing, we could be concerned, finding, we found a dead person wearing a certain article of clothing. Maybe he borrowed it. That's not necessarily an objective indicator that it's the fellow. He could be borrowing the clothing. Vichashin and the sheila. But if we're concerned about people borrowing stuff, well then chomer simane ukaf heichim adrinon. How can we return a donkey based on signs related to its saddle? Maybe they just borrowed the saddle. Lo shayle inshe ukafa demaskiv leilechama. Well, people don't lend out saddles because it will irritate the donkey, and so therefore, if you find a saddle on a donkey, the saddle belongs to the donkey, and therefore it's a good sign. But not necessarily the case with clothing. Matzu kosher, mitzvah kosher bekis uvaarnike uvtabas. So now, what about the fact? Wait, what? Yeah. Heichi me'adrinon. Wait, what? Wait, 1 second. Mitzvah kosher bekis uvaarnike uvtabas. Heichi me'adrinon. Yeah, I think the kasha is mitzvah kosher bekis uvaarnike uvtabas. Right? Also, when it comes to, right, we said that by the get. Right, if he found it tied by like his money pouch or his wallet or his signet ring, so then how can we assume that it's his get? Maybe he borrowed that stuff. Right? I mean, we had said earlier that if this get is found among a certain person's objects, right? What are the proper definitions of those things? Where am I? No. Money bag, purse, or signet rings. Yeah, what do you want me to tell you? Okay. So, but shouldn't we be concerned that maybe he borrowed those items, right? That, it was a different get, and the person who has that get borrowed those items from the other person? So, no, not really. Because, tabas chayshel is yufe. Nobody would lend out a signet ring, because if you lend out your signet ring, that's like your personal signature. Other people are going to sign things with your signature. That's a problem. You're not going to lend that out. When it comes to lending out your like money, like your wallet, people don't really do that because it's bad luck. Alternatively, the reason why you can't trust testimony about clothing is because maybe it was simply like, black pants and a white shirt. I guess black and red or whatever. Kilu, saying the color of the garment. Like that's not saying the color of the garment is not like a strong enough proof. Okay, which I guess implies that if you do have, if you assume that simanim are midoraisa and it's a proper sign like a mole or something, or maybe something better than a mole, I don't know, I guess maybe a tattoo in that other case, whatever it might be, something unique. So maybe you can rely upon it. Says the Gemara, "Vafilu ra'u meguyod v'chulei." Right, the Mishnah had said that even if you saw him like with all sorts of wounds and stuff, we cannot assume that he's dead. Remember the meguyod chaye? I understand. Is that implying that somebody who's got tons of wounds? I don't know. I mean, a fellow gets shot up. He's not dead yet, but he's got bullet holes all riddled to his body. So he's going to live. Very mini. A fellow does not cause tuma until he mamish dies. Afilu meguyod v'afilu goses, even if he's riddled with bullets or he's clearly about to die, still he's not, as long as he's alive, he's not metami. Tamuye lo metama, hamichaye lo chaye. So while he doesn't transmit, he's not going to be, metami ba'oel or anything like that, or, in any way that a mace would be metami. Fine, so he's not metami until he dies, but he's also not going to live, necessarily. Omer Abaye lo kasha. Says Abaye, it's no problem. Harib Shimon ben Elazar, harabana. Titan is, we learn in the Brisa, mi'idin ala maguyod, v'in mi'idin ala tzolov, that the Tanna Kama says that we can testify that a fellow who's like riddled with bullets is dead. We can assume that he's dead. But not somebody who's hanged. What? Somebody who's hanged, he's going to live? That seems schwer. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, it says Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Af ala maguyid ein me'idin. You also can't testify about the fellow who is riddled with bullets, because theoretically, a fellow who has these kinds of wounds could somehow, whatever you hear, people surviving pretty crazy things. So 1 second. So the Tanna Kama says that you can assume that somebody who's like got terrible wounds is dead, whereas Reb Shimon ben Elazar says that you cannot testify that a fellow who's got terrible wounds is dead, and therefore our Mishnah who says that you can't testify about somebody who's got all sorts of wounds throughout his body that he's dead is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. But can we really say that our Mishnah is Reb Shimon ben Elazar? V'akatani safe. But it says, right, we're going to learn in the Mishnah tomorrow. It says, Maise ba'asya. There was a story in Asya be'echad sheshilshalu layom. A fellow, they lowered him down into the sea by his leg, I guess. I don't know why, but they lowered him down into the sea by his leg. Also biyadam el raglo. And when they pulled him out, all they got was his leg. Friends, what do you think about that? That sounds horrible. You lower some guy down into the sea, and it's time to pull him out, and you just get like a leg that's been severed from his body. Just a leg. Okie dokie. It will also be Adam El Raglo. Vramu Chacham, the Chacham say, Minarkubo Lamaila Tinase, that if it's from the knee and up, well then you can assume that he's dead. Minarkubo Lamata Lo Tinase. But if it's from below the knee, so then he cannot get remarried. Meaning, right? So if they only pull up the leg, so if it's above the knee, so then his wife, I don't know what I said, but his wife can get remarried, because you can assume that if it got his leg got ripped off from above the knee, he's gestorben, and he's not going to survive. But if it's below the knee, then we have to be concerned that maybe he survived. Now, if it's Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Shimon ben Elazar said that he could theoretically, close the wound and heal himself. So Shaini Maya Demar Zumaka. Yeah, but water is different because it makes the wound much worse, and therefore even Reb Shimon ben Elazar would say that he would be unable to survive that. So now the Gemara says. So now the Gemara questions what Reb Shimon ben Elazar is saying. That you could theoretically heal a terrible wound by like applying heat to it. So Rabbi Bachana said, Didi Chazili, I saw how Taya Tishakul Safsira Vigaide Legamle, that he took a sword and cut off his like camel's leg or something, and it wouldn't stop like making noise until it died or something. So you see, he couldn't have fixed it. So Abaye says, well, it was a weak camel, and that's why it died and couldn't be healed. Rava Omars. Now Rava gives an alternative answer to the question of, our Mishnah had said that if a fellow has all these wounds, so then he cannot survive, then he can potentially survive, and therefore you cannot assume that he's dead. And yet we had that other brisa which said that if a fellow has all sorts of wounds, then we can assume that he's dead. So Omar Rava Omar B'sakin Milubenes V'Divrei Akol. So when we assume that he might be able to survive, it's when he gets cut with like a very hot knife, which immediately kind of the heat sort of closes the wound or something, and everyone in that case would agree that he would be able to survive. The Mishnah had continued, we said that if a wild animal is eating the fellow, we can't assume that he's dead. Amar Viuda Amar Shmuel, that is only in a place where, maybe if the wild animal is eating his foot or something. But if he's like eating his heart, so then it's a different story. So Yotza, if it's a place where his soul leaves his body, Me'idin, then we could testify that the wild animal killed the fellow. Says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Shachad bo shnaim or rov shnaim uvarach. Okay, what if you have a fellow and they like slit his throat and they mamish did a good job. Throat is completely slit. The fellow should probably say Shema Yisrael. Uvarach, but then he runs away somehow. Question is, can we assume he's dead or not? So me'idin, that we can testify this fellow's gestorben, even though he ran away and we don't actually see him dead. Ini, is this really true? But Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Shachad bo shnaim or rov shnaim, that if a fellow, they basically slit his throat pretty chazak. So the Ramaz v'Omer kisvu get liishti, and he says, write a get to my wife. He signals, probably can't talk so stark, so he signals, write a bill of divorce to my wife. They can give a bill of divorce. So we see that he seems to be alive enough to be, if he was dead, he wouldn't be able to grant a bill of divorce. So chayu v'sof olamos. Well, he's technically alive, but he's going to die. Well, if that's the case, that basically slitting someone's throat to the extent that it cuts through both the esophagus and the trachea, so he's going to die. Well, if that's the case, if you accidentally drop a knife on a fellow's throat and it slits it chazak, so then you should have to go to an ir miklat, right? If you accidentally do that, you should have to go to an ir miklat, because you accidentally murdered somebody, because we just said that if you slit somebody's throat, he's going to die. So Allah matani, but why do we learn in a brisa, shachat shnaim or rov shnaim, areza eno gole? That if you slit a fellow's throat, you do not go to an ir miklat. So ha'itmar Allah, well, it was stated, Amr of Oshaya, says of Oshaya, chashin and shem aruach bilbalto. Well, we have to be concerned that maybe the wind kind of was, it was like a sure, that was like the first step, was sort of slitting the throat, but it was ultimately the wind that kind of gave it the final push to kill him. Oh, inami shema iu kerev misaso, or maybe when you slit his throat, he was like flopping around, and he killed himself technically by flopping around. My benai, what's the nafkamina between the wind and the flopping? So the shachte beveisa the shisha ufarkes. Well, if it was in a marble house that there's no wind in there, but he's flopping around, so then if you say that the issue is the wind, there was no wind. But if the issue is the flopping, there was flopping. Inami the shachte bebar velo farkes, or that you slaughtered him outside, so there was wind, but there was no flopping. So that would be the nafkamina. Rebuta omer lokol v'chule. So now in our Mishnah we had said that we only have up to 3 days to identify the fellow. Rabbi Ben Baveh said that, well, not everything is equal. Not every person is the same. Not every place is the same. Not every hour of the day is the same. In fact, the Taka ask Akash Rabbi Yehuda Ben Baveh the Kula Palig or the Chuma Palig? Is Rabbi Yehuda Ben Baveh being lenient or is he being stringent? Right, when he says that not all the hours, not all the people are the same, maybe that means that some people could be less than 3 days, or maybe saying some people could be more than 3 days. What is it? No, Tashma, come in here. Dau Gava, there was a fellow. Titave b'Chaime, he Poshet drowned in a place called Kaime. Ve'asku Abehedra, and he was pulled out of the water at a place called Behedra. Levasut Tzlasa Yoman, and it was after 3 days. Ve'inzva Rav Dimi min Ardaya l'divisu. And Rav Dimi min Ardaya said that his wife can get remarried even though it was 3 days. Vesu au gava da'atba bediglas. There was also a story of another fellow who drowned in the Tigris River. Vasku agisha de Shvistina, and they pulled him out by the bridge of Shvistina. Vansva Rava l'divisu apuma de Shujvina l'vasu chamisha yome. And Rava, based on the accounts of his neighbors who identified him, said that his wife can get remarried, and that was after 5 days. So I understand if we're saying that Rabbi Ben Bava is being lenient. So basically, in both of these stories, where the first one was after 3 days, the second one was after 5 days, so they're doing like Rabbi Ben Bava, saying that not every situation is objective, and in this case, they were able to identify after 5 days or 3 days. But if you say that he's being stringent, well then, who are they doing like? Because if the Mishnah says that you can't identify anybody after 3 days, and Rabbi Ben Bava is being more stringent than that, so then how could they be identifying people after 3 days? Shani Maya Ditzamse. The Gemara says, well, water is actually a unique situation because it kind of keeps the fellow, intact or whatever. Like it keeps the fellow from sort of decomposing. But didn't we say that water is really bad for a wound? Yeah, if there's a wound, water is bad for it. But if there's no wound, so then it'll preserve the fellow more. Now when we're saying that they identified him later, that was if they identified him within an hour of pulling him out of the water. But if you wait, then he's going to get swollen and you won't be able to identify him anymore. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Chof of Masechta Yevamos. The first part, we had some complicated stuff, trying to understand the machlokas, the opinion of Rebbe Elazar with regard to these Sarah and Rivka and their husbands and brother-in-laws and all that kind of stuff. The question was, does Rebbe Elazar say that, is his opinion that you could trust co-wives to testify about one another, or is it we can only trust a co-wife when she herself demonstrates that she's willing to go based on her testimony? It seems to be that she would have to demonstrate that she's willing to go based on her testimony. And then we got to a very interesting Mishnah about identifying a corpse. Right, if a fellow has to identify a corpse, right, we had said that they have to have a face that is intact, and that it's not interesting questions about what's considered. At what point can you assume that a fellow is actually dead? And we said that it's dafka up to 3 days. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava raised the possibility that maybe it could be more or possibly less than 3 days as well. So super interesting daf. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.